Have you ever wondered what goes on in the mind of a leader who, even in the face of defeat, still clings to the illusion of power? Picture the scene, December 2003, Tikrit, Iraq. The once feared Saddam Hussein, the dictator who for decades held a nation under his iron fist, is found hiding in a hole. Dirty, unshaven, but surprisingly calm. His first words after his capture are incredulous. He still considered himself the legitimate president of Iraq. How do you break this mental fortress? How do you negotiate with someone who lives in a parallel reality where defeat is a mere mirage? This is the premise that leads us to one of the most fascinating and dark stories in history applied psychology, in a scenario of strategic influence. What you're about to discover may surprise you. This isn't just an account of a dictator's capture, but a deep dive into the persuasion engineering in one of the most extreme contexts imaginable. Think about the negotiators, the psychologists and strategists faced with the task of influencing a man who personified autocracy, someone whose mind seemed impenetrable. How to approach an individual who built an empire based on fear and blind obedience. Conventional negotiation tactics based on concessions and mutual interests simply didn't apply. It was necessary to go further, to unravel the intricacies of his psychology, explore their deepest vulnerabilities, and somehow plant the seeds of reason in a barren terrain of unshakable convictions. Stay with me until the end, because we're going to dive behind the scenes of this complex dance of power and influence. Let's analyze how the psychology of critical decisions under pressure was crucial in destabilizing Saddam Hussein's mind. It wasn't about brute force, but rather a war of narratives, a subtle game of psychological manipulation aimed at breaking down his emotional and intellectual armor. What triggers were activated? What strategies persuasion were used to make him question the very reality he constructed with such care and brutality? This emblematic case offers us valuable lessons about human nature, about the fragility of the ego, and about the power of strategic influence in very high-voltage situations. By understanding the psychology behind trading with Saddam Hussein, we can gain profound insights into how to influence people in any context, from high-stakes business negotiations to everyday personal interactions. The ability to understand another person's mind, anticipate their reactions, and shape their decisions through persuasion is a powerful skill, and the story we're about to uncover is a fascinating case study of this art. Prepare yourself for a journey into the mind of a dictator and the strategies used to, piece by piece, deconstruct his mental fortress. But how exactly did this breakdown happen? What were the crucial moments when the balance of power, influence started to lean? Well, the answer takes us to one of the most important pillars of psychology of persuasion, the breakdown of the perception of control. Saddam Hussein, even in a filthy hole, still believed himself to be the protagonist of his own story, the undisputed leader. For the negotiators, the first and most difficult task was to disarm this belief. They treated him not as a common prisoner, but as a head of state, maintaining a facade of respect that was, in reality, a psychological trap. By reinforcing his illusion of power, they made him lower his guard, opening the door to a strategic influence, subtle and devastating. It was a complex dance, where every word and every gesture had a purpose, a hidden layer of meaning. And here, at this point in our journey, I want to pause and ask you, have you ever felt this way, faced with a challenge that seemed insurmountable, where the only way out was to understand the other person's mind? If this subject, this mix of history and psychology, touched you in some way, I'd like to know. Leave here in the comments what surprised you the most so far, or what's your biggest question about the persuasion engineering. Your participation is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who, like us, seek to understand the complexity of human relationships and the power of influence. If you're enjoying what we're building together, please like the video to let us know we're on the right track. And if you haven't subscribed yet, click the button to join our community. Your presence here is proof that curiosity and the desire to learn are powerful drivers. After all, this story is much more than the fall of a dictator. It's about the fragility of the human mind and how even the most deeply held convictions can be deconstructed. But breaking control was only the beginning. Next, we'll discover how the negotiators used the vulnerability they created to implant new ideas in Saddam's mind and ultimately make him cooperate. Prepare to experience the power of empathy as a strategic weapon. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Behind all the negotiation, behind every calculated word, was one man. His name is George Pirro. And you need to know this name. He was the FBI special agent, the son of Lebanese immigrants, who, in one of the most audacious missions in history, was the only one tasked with interrogating Saddam Hussein. Pirro's choice was not random. His cultural heritage, his command of the language, and above all, his mentality and psychological preparation made him the perfect candidate. Pirro didn't go into battle with weapons, but with a strategy. He had the hidden truth, a meticulous plan to create a controlled parallel reality where Saddam would feel free to reveal his secrets. What followed was a real day behind the scenes of the human mind. Pirro didn't present himself as the agent he was. He knew that to disarm Saddam, he needed to pose as someone much greater than himself. He presented himself as a leader, a top-ranking expert, who had the authority to make decisions, and who was the only person capable of understanding the weight of Saddam's position. This transformation of identity was the first step in establishing a distorted bond of trust. Pirro became the mirror Saddam wanted to see. He validated Saddam's power, while subtly guiding him toward reality of his situation. It was a delicate dance of honor and humiliation, of respect and submission, in which Pirro used Saddam's own vanity against him. In these conversations, they didn't talk about weapons or politics, but about poetry, philosophy, history, about the life of a dictator. This closeness wasn't a sign of weakness, but rather the purest manifestation of persuasion engineering. Pirro knew that to get the information he needed, he had to go beyond the facts and get to the heart of Saddam's identity. He needed to make Saddam feel heard, respected, and only then could he access the revelations that were kept under lock and key. The mentality of Pirro was a patient predator who doesn't attack head-on but surrounds his prey until it falls on its own. And this approach had impact overwhelming. Saddam, accustomed to being feared, found in Pirro a figure who challenged him intellectually, but at the same time saw him as a peer. This made him lower his guard in a way no one else had. Hidden truth is that the key to opening Saddam's mind was not torture or coercion, but a psychological game of pure influence. If this psychological chess game fascinated you, comment below. That makes sense to me. But the story of George Pirro and Saddam Hussein isn't just a battle of wits. There was a very powerful emotional trigger that Pirro used to break Saddam once and for all. And that trigger was Saddam Hussein's own arrogance. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because here is the hidden truth behind all the day of negotiation. George Pirro understood that to break the mentality of a dictator, he could not attack it head-on, but rather use it to his advantage. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its impact. Pirro made Saddam believe he was his only channel of communication with the President of the United States. He positioned himself as the sole intermediary between the deposed leader and the highest power in the world. This fueled Saddam's monumental ego. a man who saw himself as an emperor. He couldn't stoop to conversing with a mere soldier or low-ranking agent. He needed someone he considered his equal, or at least someone with the authority to understand his position. Piero's subtle shift from a mere interrogator to a vital link to power was what opened the first crack in the dictator's mental fortress. This is a perfect example of persuasion by symbolic status. This technique is based on the premise that human beings are motivated by recognition and social status. By giving Saddam the status of exclusive negotiator, Piero was trapping him in a game where, to maintain his position and perceived dignity, he had to cooperate. The decisions he made were no longer based on resistance, but on fueling his own image as a leader. He became George Piero's negotiating partner, revealing important information not out of fear, but to prove to himself that he was still relevant. Those behind the scenes show us that the persuasive engineering often it's not about strength, but about subtlety. The revelations Saddam's failures in the end came not because he was physically broken, but because of his own vanity. He surrendered to Piero's psychological game because, to him, it was proof of his continued importance on the world stage. It's a fascinating example of how a person's ego can be their greatest weakness. And that's what our conversation is about. If this form of persuasion intrigues you, write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." But what happens when the most important person in your life is used against you? What was George Piero's final blow, the one that truly broke Saddam's will? The answer lies in a small detail the dictator couldn't hide. A chink in your iron armor that psychologists and strategists have been searching for. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because we're going to talk about hidden truth that governs persuasion engineering. The golden rule of influence. And it says, control the environment and you control the mind. For George Piero, every aspect of Saddam Hussein's captivity was designed to be a micro-influence with a macro impact. Nothing was random. The cell, the lighting, the sleeping and eating times, the room temperature, everything was a surgically calibrated instrument to disorient Saddam without the use of violence. A transformation in Saddam's head began there with the loss of his most basic autonomy. He, who had dictated the rules for an entire nation, could now no longer even decide when to eat or sleep. Time cycles were erased. His hierarchy was dismantled. He was no longer the president, but merely a prisoner, whose decisions were controlled by a carefully orchestrated environment. This loss of control alone was one of the greatest psychological blows. Saddam's mind, accustomed to order and obedience, began searching for a new reference point, and that reference point became, ironically, George Piero. A day us behind the scenes shows us that the persuasion is not limited to words, but manifests itself in every detail of the context. By creating a private and totally controlled universe, Piero made Saddam feel increasingly dependent. Revelations that would come later would not be just the result of a conversation, but the fruit of a slow process of dismantling his reality. Piero was, in effect, conducting a laboratory experiment with the dictator, demonstrating the power of strategic influence that operates in the shadows. He comments, total control. But there was one last link that still bound him to his old life, a vulnerability that Piero realized was the breaking point, something that no strategy, no mind game or controlled environment could defend. And that point was his family. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because after having created the illusion of power and having disoriented Saddam through environmental control, George Piero used the hidden truth most powerful of all, the power of silence. Piero knew that behind the facade of a cruel dictator lay a father and a grandfather, a man who, deep down, cared about the fate of his children and grandchildren. And it was in this vulnerability that he found the final opening. A day of Pirot in the universe of persuasion engineering shows us that the best way to get someone to open up isn't by forcing them, but by creating a space where they feel safe enough to talk. The technique Pirot used, known as strategic silence, it was simple, but in an impact overwhelming. Instead of filling the conversation, Pirot waited. He let the silence hang, a void that Saddam, accustomed to command, felt the need to fill. And when Saddam spoke, every word that came out of his mouth was a revelation, a piece of the puzzle that he himself was putting together. This subtle and patient approach demonstrates a mentality of master of strategic influence. Pirot used the controlled rapport to create a human connection, even between an interrogator and a dictator. He wasn't there to judge, but to understand. And by understanding, he was able to extract crucial information about the structure of the regime, the location of weapons, and the fate of his own family. The tip that remains for our lives, applicable in any tense situation, is, in the next meeting or difficult conversation you have, try staying silent for 3 seconds longer than usual. You'll be surprised at what the other person will say to fill that space. This little transformation in your stance can completely change the course of a negotiation. The behind the scenes from Saddam's interrogation teach us that persuasion most effective is not the one who shouts the loudest, but the one who knows how to listen. And George Pirot, by remaining silent, managed to get the dictator to speak hidden truth that he needed most. Saddam's decisions in the end, were not made under duress, but out of a desire to connect, to be heard, and to protect what was most important to him, his family. If this idea of the power of silence fascinates you, comment below. Silence is power. But how did Pirot use Saddam's love for his family as a final blow? What was the revelation? What made the dictator finally give in? Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what happened next was the most important turning point in the entire journey between Pirot and Saddam. After weeks of intense psychological play, where every detail was a micro-influence, Saddam finally broke. Not dramatically, but with a confession that would change the world's perception of the war in Iraq. He admitted it. Saddam Hussein confessed to George Pirot that he did not possess weapons of mass destruction. But here's the hidden truth. This wasn't an admission of defeat, but rather a display of pure pride. Pirot realized that Saddam refused to be seen as weak. For him, admitting the truth to an enemy would be a dishonor. However, he needed to justify himself to the only interlocutor he considered worthy. Saddam revealed that he only pretended to have the weapons to maintain fear in Iran, his arch-enemy, and to consolidate his power in the region. It was a revelation surprising, which completely changed the panorama of decisions that led to war. That mentality of dictator introduces us to a fascinating concept: the psychology of strategic bluffing and symbolic threat. Saddam didn't need to have weapons to be feared. It was enough for everyone, including the world, to believe he had them. Impact this perception was enough to maintain order and guarantee its status as a regional power. For him, the bluff was not a lie, but a strategy of influence as valid as military force. The transformation. This is where Pirot understood the logic behind the decision of Saddam. He wasn't sorry for lying, but proud of his masterstroke. This moment in behind the scenes, the interrogation teaches us that people often don't act for seemingly obvious reasons. The motivation behind Saddam's actions wasn't rationality, but a complex mix of ego, honor, and fear. He preferred to be seen as a cunning dictator who bluffed the world rather than as a weak leader who surrendered. If this play fascinated you, comment below. Master move. But the revelations Saddam's crimes didn't stop there. There was one last detail, a secret about his own children, that Pirot used to close the circle once and for all. What was the biggest vulnerability that the dictator in the end could not protect? What happened next was the result of the accumulation of all the strategies PSYOPS used. It was the final blow of a persuasive engineering patient and methodical. During the long months of interrogation, Saddam Hussein wavered. One moment he vehemently denied everything, the next he philosophized about power and history, and the next he tried with all his psychological arsenal to manipulate PSYOPS and the context. But in all these interactions, he was slowly losing the thing he prized most: control of his own narrative. And this is where we come into the crucial concept of cognitive erosion under prolonged pressure. Unlike physical torture that seeks a revelation immediate, PSYOPS' strategy was more subtle and therefore more effective. He didn't want a confession of pain, but a transformation and the mentality of Saddam. The dictator, accustomed to a life of absolute power, was now in an environment where every detail was controlled by someone else. The journey in the behind scenes from the interrogation shows that the hidden truth. It doesn't come from a single blow, but from the right drip. The loss of control, the strategic silence, and the appeal to his narcissistic ego were small impacts that together eroded his mental defenses, like water slowly wearing away at a rock. The result of this erosion was that Saddam's mind, once a fortress, began to give way. His decisions and revelations were no longer those of a self-confident leader, but of someone struggling to remain relevant in a reality that no longer belonged to him. He, the man who shaped the true, now found himself disoriented and desperate to find a new anchor point. And it is precisely at this point of maximum vulnerability that persuasion becomes more powerful. If this concept of cognitive erosion opened your eyes, comment below, cognitive erosion. But after all this day, psychological, what was the final lesson PSYOPS learned from this case? What did the story of Saddam Hussein and the psychology of critical decisions under pressure can teach us for our own lives? While you may never have to interrogate a dictator, the lessons of this day behind the scenes of persuasion engineering are completely applicable to your everyday life. Think about it. Have you ever negotiated a raise? Have you ever had to influence a difficult client to close a deal? Have you ever had to deal with a conflict in a family or at work? In these moments, you are, in a way, in negotiation criticism. The strategic report, PSYOPS, for example, isn't about making friends. It's about finding a real connection, a genuine passion or interest, to build a bridge of trust. You can do this at your next meeting by showing that you understand mentality and the challenges of your interlocutor before presenting your solution. Positioning of authority, used to make Saddam feel important, can be replicated through impeccable preparation. When you master your subject, speak with clarity and control, you project a hidden truth of power that makes your decisions are seen as more valuable. And the creation of psychological dependence. In a negotiation, this means showing the other party that your offer is so unique and valuable that it would be impossible to find an alternative. It's about positioning your value in a way that makes the other part feel they need you. The impact of this is a shift of power in your favor. And finally, the environmental control, which for Saddam was his cell, for us can be the control of a meeting. Who sets the agenda? Who starts speaking? Who chooses the room? Even in a virtual environment, having control over the dynamics of the conversation is a transformation subtle, but can change the outcome of any conflict. The big one revelation of this whole story is that strategic influence is not something mystical. It is a set of skills that can be learned and applied. It is the ability to understand the psychology behind the decisions and use it to your advantage in an ethical and intelligent way. If you're ready to apply these concepts, comment below. Strategist's mind. But what is the most important lesson of all? The one George Pirro teaches us about human nature and its relationship to power. And how can this lesson be the key to becoming not just a good negotiator, but a master of influence? Now I want to go even deeper into this subject and transport us to the final moment when Saddam Hussein was taken to court. Many saw a stubborn and defiant dictator. He shouted, made speeches, and tried to turn things around, as if he was still in charge. But in reality, behind the scenes, this scene reveals something much deeper. This behavior was not a sign of strength. It was a delayed, defensive reaction. The psychological game had already been won. Revelations and decisions of Saddam had already been extracted in Pirro's long interrogation sessions. What we saw in court was the loss of symbolic territory and defensive reactions. This concept is crucial. For a person whose identity and power depend on a narrative of control, losing that control is the greatest defeat. The tribunal, for Saddam, was the last stage where he could try to regain his mentality of supreme leader. He knew that his revelations and private confessions to Pirro had already changed the game. Now what remained was just a desperate show, a last cry from a figure who had already lost his internal battle. The impact of Pirro's tactics was so great that, even in a formal and public setting, the dictator could no longer sustain the hidden truth that he himself had built over decades. The journey of yours transformation mental was already completed. A psychology behind this final moment teaches us that the ultimate victory is not the one on the stage, but the one that happens behind closed doors. True power is not in shouting the loudest, but in being the master of influence that controls the narrative. Saddam was there, a man who had already been broken inside, pathetically trying to regain a power that no longer belonged to him. If this idea makes you wonder what true power is, comment below, symbolic territory. But what's the final lesson we can take from all this? A lesson that goes beyond the story of a dictator and that can change the way you see your own power. And how can this lesson be the key to becoming not only a good negotiator, but a master of your own life? The big one revelation of all this is that the power of influence is not in strength, but in understanding psychology human. The story of Saddam Hussein teaches us that to break the mentality, you need patience, strategy, and a deep understanding of the other person's motivations. You don't need military power to be a master of persuasion. You just need to be a master of the mental game. If this message resonated with you, if you felt this connection and realized the value of these strategies in your life, I want to invite you to join our community. If you haven't already, click the button and activate the bell. Your presence here is proof that there's a thirst for knowledge and strategies that truly work. And to know that you have come this far with me, understanding the mind of a dictator, leave a comment with the phrase, "I'm with you until the end." And if this conversation made you think and gave you valuable insights, like the video, so we know we're on the right track. Now don't stop there. I know you're ready for the next step. There's a video here that complements this topic. By clicking on it, you'll discover how a good leader, like Steve Jobs, used psychology of persuasion to change the world. Click and stay with me there.